Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Hinman. I'm Director of Community Director for the Mayo Clinic Social Media Network, and it's my pleasure today to host this webinar and to welcome you to 4 steps to creating a sustainable content calendar. It's nice to have you with us. Today, we're pleased to have as co-presenters Taryn Offenbacher and Audrey Lane Seymour. They're partnering on this presentation. Taryn is our social media lead at Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and Audrey Lane is our social media lead at Mayo Clinic in Florida. Both of them in these positions have access to all of Mayo Clinic's wide array of marketing support and content as they develop editorial calendars. But it's important to know that before they came to Mayo Clinic, both of them worked in very small organizations. Taryn was communications director of the Shared Hope International, an anti-trafficking nonprofit, and she writes that she would have been delighted to have anybody on her staff who could help her with social media. And before Audrey Lane joined Mayo Clinic, she was the entire marketing team at a small Georgia hospital. So today, they're going to share with us some really great tips about how to create an editorial calendar, how to keep it working. At the same time, they bring this perspective of not just the Mayo Clinic system, but also small organizations in which they work. So I think you're going to find some really fascinating tips here from both of them. Before I turn the time over to them, I wanted to share with you something you may not know about Audrey Lane and Taryn. When Audrey Lane was working at that small Georgia hospital, she was invited to participate in a fundraiser for Magnolia House, which is a shelter for abused women and children. And that fundraiser was that she was paired with a doctor to compete in the Dancing with the Southern Stars contest as part of this fundraiser. She taught Dr. Lott how to tap dance, and their dance to Uptown Funk won second place in the competition. So that's a little insight into Audrey Lane's other talents. And Taryn also has some experience with dancing. She was actually one time able to participate in a dance at Disney World. So both of them bring multiple skills along with their social media skills. So I'll turn the time over now to Taryn, but before I do, let me point out that throughout the presentation, we hope you will enter your questions for us. You'll see that at the top of the comment section at the side of the video. That's where you would enter any questions you have. I'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and at the end, we'll take your questions and have a really interesting, I think, Q&A. So do that while they're speaking, and now I'll turn the time over to Taryn.
Hi, thank you, Dan. Like Dan mentioned, I'm Taryn Offenbacher at Mayo Clinic here in Arizona. And today, Audrey Lane and I are excited to share 4 steps to create a content calendar. We know it's easy to begin the year with a really amazing content calendar, only to find that you loosely follow it once real-time events happen. And so in this webinar, we want to show you how to make space to prioritize truly priority content, how to curate content with proven interest, and how to build space so that you can make room for timely news. Whether you're staff of one or a really large staff, we're sure that you're going to get something out of today. We crafted this with both organizations in mind. So to get started, we're going to talk about step 1, which is gathering your analytics. And so if you were to go book a vacation or try a recipe or purchase a product, you would likely look up reviews. To know that your time and the money and the resources that you invest in that are going to be well spent and they're going to meet your expectation. And so sort of think of step 1 as really that review process, that learning process. Analytics can be daunting, and if you haven't been tracking them all year, don't worry, don't panic. There are a few metrics you're going to want to look at to help you identify what type of content to prioritize next year. So let's take a look at some of those metrics. When you're reviewing your content, here are a few key metrics that the Mayo Clinic social and digital innovation team use to help plan the next year's content. One, we look at metrics and set measurable goals looking at the platform. So some platforms are better suited to different audiences. Some platforms we see higher rates of conversion or engagement. And so we look at really how is our content performing on each platform. Second, we look at engagement, and we use shares as a really key metric to identify whether the content that we're sharing is something that people not only like and read, but also something that they feel like they can advocate for and that they want to share. The third is the type of content. We know that videos perform differently than photos and links. And so we take a look at that type of content based on the platform and the audience as well. We also look at format and audience. And in the next slide, we'll look a little bit more in depth on that. So we look at audience preference. And you can see here in this slide, the number of people who are who are visiting our page based on their device. So 2/3 of our Facebook engaged users are using a mobile device to access our content. So what that tells us is that we really want to be making sure we're thinking mobile first, because that's going to meet a majority of our viewers and our users' device preference. And then also we look at age and gender. Perfect, thank you. So we look at the number of people engaged. And so we see that 78% of our engaged Facebook users are female, and a majority of them hit in that 35 to 64-year-old age range. So now we have a really good sense of who exactly is engaging with our content, females 35 to 64. 2/3 of them are engaging on mobile devices, and this helps us move forward into planning content for the next year, accessing our content and how. In the next slide, we also look at performance. And so like I mentioned, we know that different types of content perform differently. And so I pulled the top 10 Facebook posts for Mayo Clinic. And you can see the day of the week. These posts, our top 10 posts, were posted on a Thursday or a Monday. And so what this might indicate is that our users are more inclined to be active on Thursdays or Mondays. Maybe that's when they're scrolling through our content. But it could also mean that we maybe get a particular type of story on those days. And so that's why we post it. So we would look into that. And then the other thing on this slide is the media type. And all of the top 10 posts over the last year on Mayo Clinic's account were photos. So that helps us also get a better sense of what type of content people are interested in engaging with. And so on the next slide, this is a really important slide, especially for those of you who, and all of us do, but probably to different degrees, really being able to prove the ROI of the social media team and the social media efforts. And so here we're looking at social referrals. And this means referral traffic that went to the book an appointment page. And so that the largest percentage, that blue bar, are social media referrals from Facebook. And so this gives us a really great sense also of what platforms are more likely to help take people through this lead conversion channel to pushing them onto our page to book an appointment.
Thanks, Taryn. Now I'll cover some additional tools for analytics. And again, I'm Audrey Lane Seymour. I am the social media specialist at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. So you want to look at the types of messages that you're receiving via Facebook Messenger. Find out if you can identify themes or FAQs, maybe some hot topics to discuss. And then I just wanted to share a couple of these with you. Here are a few requests we've received recently, and it helps us to get a better idea of what people are looking for. We also use Google Analytics for top website searches. And before, I would say probably 5 years ago, I really had not used Google Analytics at all, but I know that it is a free, easy to use tool. And actually in my former job as the team of one at a small hospital, I used Google Analytics for the same, for some of the same analytics. So I know that you can use it to identify the top website searches, which is what I did then, and we also do that here at Mayo Clinic. So these top 10 were the top 10 searches for the last week in 2017. So pneumonia, bronchitis, maybe some more seasonal themes here, but we look at this on a monthly to quarterly basis to identify any hot topics that are being looked for by our potential patients. All right, so step 2 is to identify your brand priorities. And you want to start off by find out what your institutional priorities are. So in the next slide, you'll see some maybe some ideas for your top priorities of your organization. You want to look at service lines, maybe some initiatives that are identified in your community health needs assessment. There may be other priorities for you to focus on throughout the year. So it's important to know these first before moving on to your marketing priorities. Now, when it comes to marketing priorities, you may have different marketing priorities for various institutional priorities. So here are a couple of priorities that you may have: brand awareness, appointment requests, event attendance, and others. And lastly, you want to look at previously covered content. So what are the conversations that your organization is involved in that you need to maintain? Perhaps your organization is the go-to authority for a certain topic, or maybe you just continue to cover a certain theme over the years. So be sure that you include that in your calendar so you stay on top of things.
All right, thanks, Audrey Lane. All right, now that you've identified what has historically worked and your priorities for the year, you can combine those things to really start diving into your 2018 content calendar. So we have 2 different options here to show you. The first is planning your content really based on this monthly calendar system. And so it's really important that you plan this content, because we know that being both from a larger and smaller organizations, that you absolutely must be reactive on social media. Sure, things are going to happen with the news, with your organization, with your users. And so you should respond to all of those things, but you don't want to rely on that strategy alone to make sure that you're prioritizing your company's key messages and communicating those priorities for the company. So there's a lot of different options out there, and in a future blog post, we're going to share some of those other tools and tactics and best ways to plan your calendar. So here's one option. First, identifying timely content. These are events or things that will absolutely happen on a certain day. And so you can see here the Donna Marathon, the Phoenix Open, and Colorectal Cancer Month campaign. Those are events that are already set. Second, we look at our priority content. So this is content that's not necessarily tied to a specific event or campaign with a deadline, but it's absolutely content that you need to prioritize for your organization. And then the third bucket is going to be your secondary content. And you see here a sports medicine expert interview. And these might be your secondary priorities, things that you need to maintain for the organization, but that you would not prioritize above the other 2. So now in our second option, planning important content first, looking at a topical approach. And so making a list of the different things that you need to consider. So for a healthcare organization, there are a lot of health awareness months. And so we take a look at those months and try to align content there, knowing that there's going to be an increase of discussion on that, likely on Twitter and other channels as well. We look at events, marketing campaigns, themes like New Year's resolutions, product launches, promotions, and holidays. These are just some examples. You might have different things within your organization or your industry, but it really helps you see throughout the course of the year that a lot of programmatic work or practice work that's already happening is going to take up a lot of space on the calendar. And that also lets you see where there might be holes to fit in content that is that priority content we were discussing, but doesn't necessarily fit into one of these categories. Maybe it's content that's not already being driven by a program or a practice.
Thanks, Taryn. Now that we've discussed your timely, primary, and secondary content, now let's talk about ways to fill your calendar. So I mentioned Google Analytics earlier. I suggest using as many reports as you can for that. And you also have link shortening tools such as Bitly that give you a lot of insight into what your followers are into. So here I have the Bitly network top content, and Bitly displays in real time the content that has the most engagement by your brand's customers. So it's measured based on clicks for the time frame you specify. What I have here is the Bitly network top content, which shows clicks on links that were organically created by other users, so not Mayo Clinic. And this is from December 20th through January 19th. So for the last month, this shows the content that our followers chose to create a shortened link and then share. So that just gives more insight into what our viewers are into. You can also make internal stories external. So I love this sweet story here that shows how a nurse at one of our hospitals found some old fabric and she turned those into adorable gowns for their tiniest patients. And no one would have known of that had she not told. So it was an internal story, and then we created an external story for it. And you can see that it's gotten a lot of reactions and shares. So that's one example of how we turn internal stories into external stories. Next, and probably the most easy thing to do, is quotes. And quotes are simple yet very effective. These two examples I have here, the first one is from Dr. Q, who is I would say he's one of our most famous physicians. He had an interview done recently, and after reading the interview, I thought this was an amazing quote. Before anything was even done with the interview, I pulled this quote and just turned it into a text overlay on a background, and that quote, that image, was actually our top performing tweet for the week of Christmas. And the one on the right is a quote that I pulled from a video that I saw of one of our physicians at an event for cancer patients. So I loved it. I pulled it and again put it as a text overlay on a background and attributed the quote to him, and that too has been high performing. And lastly, I recommend using Google Trends. So if you go to trends.google.com, you can view trending stories in real time, and you can also narrow the category to health topics. So Sean's demonstrating what we're doing, how to narrow that topic down to, or narrow the category to health. And if you want to create content about any of these top stories, trending stories for the day, then I recommend that you take a look at Jeff Calloway's post that he had back in November, all about newsjacking. And if you were at our annual conference in December, you heard how his team at Cook Children's Hospital in Texas very successfully newsjack every day. So check out more there on the Mayo Clinic social media network.
All right, now that you have done step 1, you've reviewed your analytics. Step 2, you identified organizational priorities. Step 3, you outlined the type of content that you want to plan for. So that priority content, timely, secondary, and other curated assets like Audrey Lane mentioned with quotes and videos and trends. Now it's time for fun. It's time to create it and schedule it. So a few things on post scheduling. everyone has a different content calendar. Some organizations, it's really feasible to post, say, once a day on Facebook. Other groups post 12 or 15 times a day on Facebook. So it's a little tricky to say how often should you be posting. But Mayo Clinic did a study on post frequency, and the social and digital innovation team tried posting 4 times a day on our Facebook page for 3 weeks. 8 times a day and 12 times a day, each for 3 weeks. And in the end, what we found is that the daily average total engagement, so the number of engagements for the day, summing all of the posts together, we saw a greater number of engagements when we posted 12 times a day. That's about 7,600 engagements per day. 5,600 when we were only posting 8 times a day, and 4,500 average total engagements when we were posting 4 times a day. But when we look at individual posts, the average engagement per post was actually most when we only posted 4 times a day. And then it would drop to 700 when we posted 8, and 634 times when we posted 12 times a day. So what this helped us understand is that on a day-to-day basis, when we have fairly equal content, we're okay with posting 12 times a day and really not limiting that, because in the end, we have greater engagement. But when there's a really important priority story that you have, say a release that you really want to make sure that your audience focuses on and sees, that might be a time to consider posting just once a day or only a few things a day, so that you don't kind of crowd that calendar. And then the next thing is post timing. When should we post? There are a lot of studies out there. I read a lot on this. And in the end, is that the afternoon slump is when a lot of people tend to be scrolling through social media. So this one study showed that the sweet spot is 1 to 3 p.m. with the highest rate of engagement Thursdays and Fridays, peaking Friday afternoon. Another study looked at engagement and had a very similar finding. Thanks. So posting on Facebook between 1 and 4 resulted in the highest average click-through rate. So those are rates of people actually clicking and going through to the link that you provide, peaking around 3 p.m. and bottoming out right before 8 a.m. and after 8 p.m. And then a third and final study showed that the best time to post on Facebook is, again, that afternoon time between 1 and 4. So I would encourage you to look at your own engagement numbers and really figure out if that aligns to what you're seeing on your channels or not. But again, using that as sort of a general guide for timing your content. So thank you so much for joining Audrey Lane and myself for this webinar. I do want to mention that we will be writing a series of blogs that will release today through Friday. And we're going to take each of these steps and look at them in greater depth, offer some additional tools that we have found helpful. We'll include links and templates and all of that. So please check back on the Mayo Clinic Social Media Network blog today through Friday to find that additional information.
So thanks a lot, Taryn and Audrey Lane, for this very specific step through about creating and maintaining a calendar. We've got some really good questions that have already come into the community site on the right-hand side of this. I invite anybody who has more questions to go ahead and post them there now. But if we go back to one of your earliest points in the presentation, I think, I can't remember now if it was Taryn or Audrey Lane was pulling the top 10 posts. And there's one question about that. Are you using a third-party platform, or is there a sort within Facebook? That must have been the top 10 Facebook posts. Is there a sort within Facebook that helps you easily pull those up, or do you use an outside service for that?
So both. The answer is both. The print screen that we included on this slide was something that we pulled from Sprinkler, which is the third-party content platform that we use. But if you go into Facebook, Business Manager, Insights, there's a column on the left, and that has a variety of different options. You can look at your audience, engagement, posts, all of that. You can see your top performing posts there, and you can also export that data and sort it. And Facebook Insights has more analytics than you will ever want when you download that Excel file.
Okay, great. That's really good to know. People responded really immediately to Audrey Lane, to your example of the quotes that you pulled from 2 different sources and just turned them into quotes. So 2 questions about that. First one is, what software do you use when you're doing these, creating these quote images?
Yeah, thanks. So I used Photoshop, but there are many free options out there. I'm very familiar with Photoshop, so that's what I used. But I know there are options out there. I think Dan has presented on a couple for creating images that are free, and also specific to the platform to which you're posting.
Great. And so let me ask Taryn the same thing. Taryn, when you create images for social, do you use Photoshop or something else?
I do, but I also found Canva, C-A-N-V-A, to be a really helpful tool. If you go to canva.com, they have social media templates there. They have a variety of free stock images and text applications. So it's already beautifully designed, and it's a drag and drop design system, which is great if you don't have access to or the skills on Photoshop. So that's one option. But there are also a lot of iPhone apps if you want to download. So there's PixArt and Tada and things like that. And we'll share this in the blog. We'll make a note. And you can just do a mobile app as well to create that, send it to yourself via email if you typically upload from a desktop.
Thanks, Taryn. I am also a big fan of Canva. I know that Buffer also has a feature called Pablo that you can use easily to format quotes for Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, of course, as well. So there are a lot of options like that. Another question about the quotes, Audrey Lane, is it has to do with getting approval for content. So when you decide to create a quote image, do you check with the person first and say, is it okay if I use your quote on Twitter, on Facebook, or what's your approval process?
It depends. So with these 2 quotes that I shared, they are already going to be, well, the interview with Dr. Q is going to be published, and the speech that Dr. Tan was giving was public on YouTube. So I did not get their approval for that, but I did send it to them after it was published, and they were absolutely thrilled. If it is a quote that is taken kind of off the record, then I definitely send to them beforehand and ask if it's okay. Is there anything they would like to change about it? So, so the answer is both. It just depends on the context.
That's good to know. And then maybe this is a bigger question too. When both of you are creating your editorial calendars, do you have a process? Is there a content approval process that you kind of integrate into your process, or how do you manage that generally?
Yeah, so I'll speak first and then invite Taryn to join in. But we have a small subgroup on our team. There are 5 of us, and we call ourselves the Fab Five. And we were meeting every day up until earlier in January. We started meeting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And we go through all of the content that we have placed on our calendar. We'll talk about upcoming events. maybe some situations we're running into with approvals or whatnot. And then if we don't get to anything on the call, or if something comes up maybe on a Tuesday where we need an answer before our Wednesday call, then we'll email back and forth, and it's a really quick process. Taryn, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that certainly working in healthcare, there are HIPAA considerations and all of that. And so your public affairs department, or if you and you alone are the public affairs department, the media, because getting a signed media consent form from a patient is something that, we certainly have to do. Mayo Clinic does really benefit from having an entire news and news delivery team, a media relations team that kind of feeds a lot of content into the funnel and allows us to pull from that for social media. Approvals are necessary, definitely for anything related to patients generally, and then just sort of as a professional courtesy to your peers. But, if you ever are waiting on approvals, there's some content that probably can already be pulled and you don't need that. And so a few things that we've done is repurpose content that we've used in books. And so the Mayo Clinic Social Media Network released a small book about 2 or 3 years ago that had a story from individual contributing authors, and we repurposed that. We copied each author's story and put it into a blog post once a week throughout the year. It was still really great, really timely, really informative, but because it was in a printed book form, we know a lot of people might not have access to it, and we didn't have to go back and ask for their permission again because they already gave us permission when the book was published. So you might be able to find content like that as well.
I'll also add to Taryn's point, being on a small team or being the team of one, you may wonder what you should include in your media release form. And on the Mayo Clinic Social Media Network website, under resources and then Mayo Clinic resources, we share our Mayo media release form for you. So we invite you to take a look at it to see what we include. And if you need to adopt or adapt, feel free.
Those are great tips. Question now about timing of posts. You gave a great example of how you sorted through to determine what the best times were to post on Facebook. Are those times, have you found they're similar for Twitter, or is it a whole different beast? And so how do you adapt for the various platforms as far as timing and frequency?
That's a really great question. We post about hourly. Mayo Clinic posts about hourly on Twitter. So those times don't necessarily dictate posting as in such a large role that it might on something like Facebook, because we do post so frequently, and because frankly tweets are pushed down almost instantly if you're following enough groups. And then on Instagram, they're not even necessarily showing content in chronological order anymore. So yes, it's, I would still consider it. Maybe posting a photo at midnight when you think most of your users are asleep would not be most ideal for engagement. But again, with a limited posting schedule there, I would probably try to hold to that afternoon slump, something like that, when people are commuting to and from work. But really what I found with the Facebook, in addition to just timing our Facebook posts, and we do post about every other hour between work, during working hours. So again, we do kind of span the whole day, but in planning a Facebook Live, this is just anecdotal evidence, and I'm sure at some point we'll study this as well, but I noticed that our afternoon broadcasts, at least here in Arizona, tend to see higher viewership than if I did something early in the morning. And that might be because we are capturing the folks on the East Coast who are traveling, commuting home at that time, and also that afternoon slump for people here on the West Coast.
Yeah, I've observed that too from Facebook Lives in Florida. And also not only in the afternoon, but in the middle of the week. So Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Facebook Lives are performing better than a Monday or a Friday Facebook Live.
And now a question about the particular calendar you use. When you're calendaring these various events or various pieces of content, what calendars do you use, and how do you coordinate with others on your calendars?
Sure, I can start. And Audrey Lane, please feel free to jump in. So one of the major reasons we actually stayed away from presenting too much on calendars is because we know that every organization has a different system. And what works for a Mayo Clinic with a team of 8 coordinating content across a variety of channels is going to be very different than the solution that's going to work potentially for a smaller healthcare organization with just 1 or 2 people. So we use Sprinkler, spelled like sprinkler, but with no E. And that has been really great. There's a planner function in that. And so we can see, similar to if you use Outlook calendar, it looks pretty much similar to that, where every hour is chunked into our different news stories and we can preview those there. But I know Hootsuite offers that, and then other groups I've seen use Google Files, Google Docs, or Excel sheets, things like that to track content. Audrey Lane?
Yeah, I'll add that in addition to Sprinkler, sometimes we want kind of a virtual whiteboard to work off of, and we will use Google Docs to just put all of our ideas down and then go from there. When I was at a smaller organization and was the sole public affairs marketing person, I kept a Word document with 3 months ahead of things that I wanted to cover. And then I also had a whiteboard in my office that I kept filled with ideas and events coming up. And, you have emails that should be sent out and newsletters. So that helped to keep track of everything, having that Word document that was always open on my computer.
Yeah, and one other thought, something that is free to use, might be worth checking out, is a Trello, Trello, and we wrote a blog about that recently. But Trello has a widget that you can install, and it's a calendar option. And so you can organize a whole calendar, include attachments, assign people to the different posts, set deadlines, create a checklist, all of that, have a whole discussion within a post thread if somebody's working on it. And that's a really great option as well. So you're organizing everything into these lists, and then you can see it in a calendar form.
Trello is really useful. I had not used it before Taryn implemented it as our editorial director for our blog. And since then, I've just loved it because it's so easy to see what's coming up next and who's doing what and when I need to start working on something. So I love it.
I like that tip for Trello. Another question has to do with integrating healthcare providers into your planning for your editorial content. Do you go outside your team to get ideas from any others in your organization, such as healthcare providers?
I do. I don't solicit content ideas, but they seem to just give them to me whenever I pass them in the hallway. So just earlier this week, I was meeting with a physician who's a radiologist, and he was telling me about some cool ideas he has for social media. So I'll be meeting with him in the future to talk about how we can make that happen.
Right. Sorry, this is Karen. And there also might be some stories that are very unique to your organization, and maybe there's something that are easy to pass by because they're maybe an everyday or a common occurrence. So yes, absolutely pulling in physicians and other healthcare providers. But you know, a great asset to me has been really making friends with some of the nurses on our team. And I just asked them, if you have photos from things that you're doing on the unit that you can share, please send them to me. And they'll just text those over. And, you know, certainly we have to be considerate of patient, you know, concerns and if there's immediate consent. But sometimes it's, you know, the nurses all dressed like elves and we're going to pass out cookies. And that's a really nice way to sort of show some of the spirit of your organization and in a very easy and organic way.
One way that I have learned to get more content ideas from these physicians, and, you know, you just got to capitalize on the fact that physicians are extremely competitive. So if you have a physician, let's say I quoted a physician or I shared a story about one, or maybe he was in a Facebook Live, and then I share some metrics of that post with his department chair, then that department chair, or, you know, I may even just share it with the rest of team, but the others will want to get on board and beat that physician. So I've got a lot of competition in a lot of different service lines right now, and I think that helps us fill out our calendars.
Yeah, competition is a fun idea. One thing you also do, Audrey Lane, I think, I mean, you do have, I've noticed, you do kind of open-ended consult opportunities for physicians, right? Where you can block a little time in a day and you say to physicians, come in and talk to me if you have any questions about anything I can help you with social media or whatever. And in any of those sessions, do you ever ask for ideas? What are you doing? What's going on in your right now that people might want to know about?
Yeah, I do. So those open-ended consultation hours are called drop-in social media consults. And I go to where the physicians are. I don't want them, I know they're never going to just wander into my cubicle. So I go to the surgeon's lounge, and once a week, I'm there for an hour or two, just depending on my schedule. And I'll tell you, the first time I ever did that, I had 6 physicians stop in, find out what I'm doing. And then, you know, after I tell them who I am, what I do, then I start asking them, like, you know, what do you do here? And what's the most interesting case you've ever seen? And we just start conversations that way. And then each week, I feel like I know these folks a little better, and they're more comfortable with sharing stories with me. And they also ask for advice on social media. So I'm helping them become more active on their personal accounts, but also they're giving me ideas for ours.
I like that. I like how that works for you. Another question, do you know if there is a way to see which social media platforms are most popular in your specific area? That information would also be helpful in determining where to focus our efforts. So any way of knowing that, any way you're aware of that would give you that information?
I can't think of any off the top of my head for a specific geographic area.
You can get counts on Facebook. If you say, for instance, you go into a boost post function and you say, I want to reach people within a 12-mile radius, they'll tell you how many people are on Facebook, for example. Twitter gives you that same kind of function, but I'm not sure how, if there's one source that says, oh, here are the amount of people that are on the various platforms within a geographical area. You'd have to do some digging, I think. Taryn, do you have a thought at all?
Yeah, I was going to say, I also don't know, besides what Dan just mentioned, for how to figure out sort of what's most relevant in your geographical area. But I might also wonder who your audience is. And so who are you really trying to reach? And so, you know, each platform being skewed a little bit towards a different population. So seeing that LinkedIn is really geared towards professionals. And so we share more business and professional oriented content there. Itself more as a 24-hour news cycle. And so we share content that's more informational on Twitter because it's where people are going to get these updates and news. Facebook is a little bit more consumer oriented. I think people are more inclined towards stories and videos, and we see that perform fairly well on Facebook. And Instagram, because it's, you know, it tends to skew a little bit younger demographic. So we really focus, I would say, more on the nature of the platform and the demographic of our user, and but demographic meaning probably age and gender a bit more than we do really on geography.
So it comes back to that strategic question: who am I trying to reach, and what platform are they most likely going to be on? And so, how do I select that? Audrey Lane, you had a comment, I think.
Yeah, I think there are probably some Google Analytics tools that would help you. I don't know of any specifically that would allow you to determine which platforms people in your area are using, but you could use Google Analytics to identify you would use it to identify where your website visitors are coming from. And if it's social media, then you could drill down to which platform. So while that's not the answer to the question, it could be used to at least get an idea of that.
Yeah, I like that. I like that suggestion. Karen, you have something too?
I was going to say, yeah. Okay. I would, now this is a challenge, I would be happy to do a little bit more research on it. And if we find anything, we will put it in one of our blog posts.
Okay, great. Now a question about evergreen content, and kind of a twofold one. From the question that we have on the community is, how do you reuse evergreen content on social? I'm interested in that question. I'm also interested in identifying which evergreen content you would reuse on social. So how about tackling that?
So I'll start and then hand it over to Taryn. But for evergreen content that we post on Twitter, we actually look to see how those posts are performing. And you may, if you visit Mayo Clinic's Twitter account and you just start scrolling through, you may see that there are multiples of the same post, and that's because we select the highest performing tweets and we repost them. So it can only be done with evergreen content, but we've seen that reposting that top performing content actually results in even higher engagement.
Sure. Another great place to sort of dig for evergreen content is your own website. And so maybe you have a page that describes your care team. Absolutely okay to set up a post that says, have you met our team? Click here, and have that page there. If you have if you have a blog, if you have books or videos or, facts, FAQs, frequently asked questions, things like that. Those are all, good things to include as evergreen content. If you have brochures or flyers, things like that. So that's one way to just sort of mine for that content, in addition to what Audrey Lane mentioned. And then how you can repurpose it. So you can't really repurpose it on Instagram because there's just not enough new content probably there. It would show up on your page twice. So we don't repurpose things on Instagram. Twitter is easy because the half-life of a tweet is so small that nobody's going to remember that you tweeted that 2 days ago or 3 days ago, a week ago. So it's okay to be a little bit more loose with that platform. So I'd also consider how much you post on each platform, and if it's going to look like you're just repeating posts, I'd stay away from that. But if it's going to be varied, then it's okay to repost.
I'll also add that in news you can use over the past 2 to 3 weeks, there have been several articles on creating evergreen content and how to repurpose it.
That's a great resource. Do you have any advice about how frequently to incorporate evergreen content into your editorial calendar?
Yeah, I've heard the stat before. And when we look at evergreen content, really look at what that content is. And so there are different numbers out there, but a number I've seen is that 80% of content should really meet the needs of your audience, and 20% can be promotional. So this means make sure that most of the time your audience feels like they're either being entertained or informed or inspired. And then a smaller percentage of that time, say 20% of that time, could be things like, we have a new member on our team, something like that. While it isn't, informative to your base, it really is, it's your brand's messaging. It's really communicating your company to them. So I would say consider what type of evergreen content it is really, and maybe try to stick to that 80-20 rule.
So another really good question has to do with, as you're developing your editorial calendar and making the decisions about what to run when, how much organic versus paid play into that decision making? And do these principles apply to one more than the other?
So I'll take the first stab at that. For our team, for social media, and Mayo Clinic is a little different than a lot of organizations. So most of our paid sponsored content is actually pushed through by our marketing folks. So we, the social media team, up until this year, were not paying for any content. We were simply posting everything organically. We did have that paid content showing to those audiences, but everything you would see on the Mayo Clinic page and in your newsfeed, unless you were in one of those targeted audiences, was organic. So this year, our budget has changed, and we are allowed to put a few dollars behind our posts, but not all of them. Now, when it comes to figuring out what's going to be on our calendar, what we do is look at all of the stories that we have, going through these 4 steps. We look at everything we've got on our calendar, and then for me in Florida, I know that I'll choose a couple that are like top priorities for our institution or our specific site, so Florida specific marketing priorities, and I'll boost a few posts that I've put on the planner for that. So we look first at the stories, and like Taryn said, we look at what our viewers need and what they want, and then we go through it again and determine if we're going to boost it or not.
Yeah, I think this is really dependent on the budget that you have and the objectives that you have to meet. So I'm in a small social media healthcare work group here in Arizona, and the teams are structured very differently. Some organizations, most of their content is paid. And so they have a smaller team, but everything they post, they use that small team to post very targeted content, and they put their budget behind that. Other teams don't have any money for social media. They don't have any budget towards advertising. So everything they do has to be really well crafted because it has to perform on its own, really, or organically on social. And then I would say Mayo is a little bit of a hybrid in that we tend to look at what content is already performing well organically. So if we post something and we see engagement is really strong on it, we'll put a little extra money to boost it. So we're not taking bad content and paying to get it to more people. We're taking good content and giving it a little boost to reach more people. So we're really working with the algorithm there.
You know, I will add that Taryn and I really have the best of both worlds because we are the only social media person at our sites in Arizona and Florida, but we also have the team. So, you know, sometimes we do feel the pains of being the only person at the organization, but then we also have the benefit of having the entire team across all 3 campuses of Mayo Clinic. So we do function as the sole person when it comes to site-specific priorities, like I mentioned, and then we have the institutional priorities that we all share.
So I've got one last question. We're approaching the top of the hour now, but has to do with patient stories. And how important do you think patient stories are in your editorial calendar? And do you feel like well, the question really is, as to stories from a patient perspective, how has Mayo experienced extra success by utilizing patient stories on social?
I can start. Patient stories are a large part of what we post. Primarily, I would say because we have multiple teams in other departments or other teams in public affairs who are producing those stories. We see patient stories do really well with engagement, lots of likes and shares. In terms of conversions, so appointment requests and click-throughs, we found that content that actually has the highest level of click-through tends to be content that is actually addressing a need that individual might have. And so they're actually how-tos, you know, how to take care of this or how to take care of that. So that's patient stories play a role and certainly an important role, but I would look at your objectives.
I agree. And I also think that it depends on your organization size. So, you know, we have, like Taryn said, we have teams that are working on patient stories. At my previous organization, we did not have teams that were working on patient stories. But every patient story that I worked on and I shared had engagement that was through the roof. And it's because the area, our audience was, I think the audience size was about 70,000 people. So very, you know, it's a small community hospital. And anytime you share pictures and stories about patients, everybody knows everybody. So you get a lot more engagement on patient stories versus how-to guides or information on a certain disease or condition.
Well, thanks, Taryn and Audrey Lane, for this really very useful, inspiring, thorough, I think, explanation about developing and maintaining an editorial calendar. We really appreciate you bringing your expertise to our audience. Before we say goodbye, I want to mention that we already know next month's webinar on February 22nd at 1 p.m. Central. Marie Ennis O'Connor will present how to create an awareness campaign with social media. So We hope you'll join us then. And as Taryn and Audrey Lane mentioned earlier in their presentation, they're going to follow this webinar with a series of blog posts here over the next week or two that will give even some more examples and details about editorial calendar. So keep your eyes open for that. Come back to the Community Watch for those blog posts. Thanks everyone so much for joining us today. We'll see you next month.
Thanks.
Bye.